Professor David Andrew Tizzard, and welcome to the first lecture on Eastern and Western culture in Korea. Obviously, this is one of the first times we're doing this online, so I hope everything's working for you. I'm doing the best my end to make sure everything goes as smoothly as possible. At the end of this video lecture, I'll explain some things about the E-class system and upcoming assignments, but before that, I just want to kind of get straight to the material. Now, just as a very brief introduction, I guess, we're doing East and West culture, and these terms can be rather controversial for some people. To some people they make sense, to other people they're problematic, to some people they're geographic, to other people they're cultural, they're historic, they're ethnic. So what you need to do over the next 15 weeks of this semester is work out what you understand by the terms Eastern and Western culture, and whether they are applicable, whether they're useful or not, because that's really at the heart of what we're doing here. And you'll experience or you'll encounter lots of different views. It's up to you to first understand and then critically analyze or critically think about these terms and ascertain what you think is best going forward. So just beware of that. When we use East and West, we are talking in generalizations, this kind of 일반적으로 style, and for some people, geographic, economical, global north, global south. That's where we're starting. We're going to look at today a chapter from this book. So this book is called The Geography of Thought, Richard E. Nisbett, and How Asians and Westerners Think Differently and Why. Do Asian people and Western people think differently and why? We always get this element of trepidation because we feel hesitant to evaluate, to judge cultures, to say that they're different. We all want to be seen as equal humans, especially before the law in a legal sense. And we sometimes get this push and pull of whether we should acknowledge differences, accentuate differences, sort of magnify them, or whether we should be focusing on similarities. And if people do think differently, as this author suggests, and it's up for you to understand the arguments and then interpret them yourself, if different cultures do think differently, what are the results of that? How does that play out in the real world, politically, economically? And if there are different goals, would some thought patterns be more applicable to achieving those goals than other goals? So, for example, not just to say that one way of thinking is better than the other, but if there was a certain goal, that goal might be, family harmony. That goal might be the development of certain ideas. It might be economic success. Would the different patterns of thought have different rates of success when trying to achieve those? Interesting to consider. We'll have a look at Richard Nisbett's work. You should have the file available to you. I've shared that. We're going to look at chapter 3. So if you want, you can read before that. It's well written and it's easy to read. It's not too deep or academic, but it's written in the common vernacular, so you should be able to understand it. My advice would be this: if you haven't read it yet, pause the video, press stop, go and read it yourself, and then as you're reading it, get your own ideas, highlight and question the own parts that stick out to you, that make your brain go no, or yes, that's right, that's wrong. Find those parts by yourself, because they will be different from the parts that I highlight when I read it. So if you do that, then you'll have two perspectives on the work. If you wait and you let me read through it first, you'll be following more likely just my perspective, and you might be influenced by it either positively or negatively. So my advice would be, if you haven't read it, go and read it first quickly. Okay. If you have, Let's continue. So, chapter 3, living together versus going it alone. Nisbett says, most Westerners, or at any rate most Americans, are confident that the following generalizations apply to pretty much everyone. Each individual has a set of characteristic, distinctive attributes. Moreover, people want to be distinctive, different from other individuals in important ways. People are largely in control of their own behavior. They feel better when they are in situations in which choice and personal preference determine outcomes. People are oriented toward personal goals of success and achievement. They find that relationships and group membership sometimes get in the way of attaining these goals. People strive to feel good about themselves. Personal success and assurances that they have positive qualities are important to their sense of well-being. People prefer equality in personal relations, or when relationships are hierarchical, they prefer a superior position. People believe the same rules should apply to everyone. Individuals should not be singled out for special treatment because of their personal attributes or connections to important people. Justice should be blind. So these, as you can tell, are generalizations. It's very important to note here that we're talking about this. The world is a sabasa, person by person world, but we're talking in generalizations. And it's interesting to note that Nisbett says most Westerners believe that this applies to everyone, not just themselves, but to everyone. They have this mode of thinking, this cognitive map, and they don't just attribute it to their own culture, but to the human race in general. You know, that sort of applies that way. If we just take one, we'll pick them apart a little bit later. But if we just take one, people want to be different. People want to be different as a Western generalization. And, you know, there is, from my own experience growing up, university and high school in England and Australia, there is kind of a lot of truth to that. You spend a lot of time trying to stand out, trying to be a unique individual that's different from everybody else. Of course, when you do things like that and you dye your hair and you get piercings or tattoos, you end up actually just looking like all the other people that dyed their hair and got piercings and tattoos. So it doesn't really help you become distinct, but there is that desire for it. And you might have to question, in general, is that desire as much here as in the West? You know, when you look at these things, so Gert Hofstede did a study on cultures, and you know, he described whether cultures were collective or independent, and masculine and feminine. If you haven't looked at Hofstede's work, we'll have a look at that at some point. But it was important in his work that things are not just binary. It's not just you're 100% individual and 0% collective, or you're 100% collective and 0% individual. It doesn't work like that. You know, it works on binary. It doesn't work binary. It works on sort of a sliding scale, and these scales might go up and down, right? So where, let's say, for example, the West might have been more individual. When I say the West, let's say Western Europe, or even that's very broad, but America might have been more individual. But you might notice, as you know, the rise of Bernie Sanders and identity politics and focusing on certain group collective things, that it might start coming more towards the collective way of being and identity. And in the East, or certainly maybe in the Confucian countries, where it's Vietnam, South Korea, China, where the focus was very much on the collective, maybe there you're seeing it slide towards the more individual way, where people are deciding, well, I'm not just going to follow my parents and do these things, but with filial piety, I'm going to start being individual. So you might see the two things are actually converging. What would happen if they pass each other on the way? The point here, what I'm trying to say is, don't try to think of these ideas and these concepts in binary yes or no. It's more to what degree, how much, and what percentage of these things. I think that's a more accurate and comprehensible way to see these things. So these are the generalizations that Nisbett applies to Americans. He continues, there are indeed hundreds of millions of such people, but they are to be found primarily in Europe, especially Northern Europe, and in the present and former nations of the British Commonwealth, including the United States. The social psychological characteristics of most of the rest of the world's people, especially those of East Asia, tend to be different to one degree or another. There's that idea of scale. So this is applicable perhaps primarily to a certain group of people. So what's the non-Western self? Nisbett says, there is an Asian expression that reflects a cultural prejudice against individuality. The peg that stands out is pounded down. That's something that I have come across here in South Korea over the last 15 years. The nail that stands out gets hammered back in, and people avoid being the outsider, the wangda, because that means ostracization. You know, people don't want to be isolated like that. He says, in general, East Asians are supposed to be less concerned with personal goals or self-aggrandizement than are Westerners. Group goals and coordinated action are more often the concerns. Maintaining harmonious social relations is likely to take precedence over achieving personal success. Success is often sought as a group goal rather than a personal badge of merit. Individual distinctiveness is not particularly desirable. For Asians, feeling good about themselves is likely to be tied to the sense that they are in harmony with the wishes of the group to which they belong and are meeting the group's expectations. Equality of treatment is not assumed, nor is it necessarily regarded as desirable. So there's a few things in here. I mean, if you think about the economic development of countries such as South Korea, through the 1960s, but more in the 1970s and 1980s, coming up to sort of the mid-90s and then the Asian financial crisis. But that economic development, that miracle on the Han River, a lot of that was seen as a group goal, as a collective thing towards which people were working, and then that's Haeun Malundong, the new village movement, and doing it together. And that was done at the expense of the individual, whether it was in terms of human rights, whether it was in terms of artistic expression, but there was a collective goal that took precedent over individual goals during that time. So, you might want to put your mind into that time frame, because it seems maybe that's applicable there. You have a look at this. Equality of treatment is not assumed, nor is it necessarily regarded as desirable. So different rules for different people, it's saying here. They don't assume, in this general view, that everybody gets treated the same. That might not even be the best. We need different rules for different people. Now, if you take the arrival, for example, of kaptil, and kaptil is when a superior in a relationship abuses or mistreats a subordinate in a relationship. Now, with kaptil, most relationships in Northeast Asia are hierarchical. So you have the two friends which are equal, and that's based on the same age. But if there's a 2-year gap, even if there's a 1-year gap, if there's a gap in rank or positions, the relationships are hierarchical. It's not always on age. It might be on title or position, things like that. But for a lot of them, the relationships are hierarchical. And if those at the top in the relationship, the kap, mistreats the ul, this thing arrives called kaptil. Now, kaptil, of course, has been going on for a long time, this mistreatment of the juniors. But if you look at it, only started getting reported and becoming a thing from about 2014-15. It's only in the last 5 years that, this word or this concept has come into people's head to say, well, this is actually unfair. This shouldn't be happening like this. Of course, it makes perfect sense to us now when we see, the very disturbing videos and we read the incidents of things going. But maybe that wasn't always the case. Maybe at the time people thought, well, there are different rules and people act like that. So that behavior was taking place before, but it was perceived differently. Now perhaps it's being perceived as more negative. So that's what it says. Equality of treatment is not assumed, nor is it necessarily regarded as desirable. There would be historic and cultural reasons for that, whether one agrees with them or not. The rules that apply to relationships in East Asia are presumed to be local, particular, and well specified by roles rather than universal. This is the exact opposite of how the book started. It said that Western values are presumed to be universal. This is how we do it, so this is how everybody should do it. You know, human rights were codified by the American president's wife in Paris in 1945, and said, you know, you get some people writing down a list on a piece of paper, then they say this applies to everyone in the world, not just your group, not just our group, everyone in the world. Where Nisbett is saying here that these values are presumed to be, well, they're our values, they're not yours, they're ours. So there's a big difference there. An Asian friend told me the most remarkable thing about visiting American households is that everyone is always thanking everyone else. Thank you for setting the table. Thank you for getting the car washed. In her country, everyone has clear obligations in a given context, and you don't thank people for carrying out their obligations. Choice is not a high priority for most of the world's people. An East Asian friend once asked me why Americans found it necessary to have a choice among 40 breakfast cereals in the supermarket. And Asians do not necessarily feel their competence as a decision maker is on the line when they do have to make a choice. Most Americans over a certain age well remember their primer called Dick and Jane. Dick and Jane and their dog Spot were quite the active individualists. The first page of an early edition from the 1930s, the primer was widely used until the 60s, depicts a little boy running across a lawn. The first sentences are, see Dick run, see Dick play, see Dick run and play. This would seem the most natural sort of basic information to convey about kids, to the Western mentality. But the first page of the Chinese primer of the same era shows a little boy sitting on the shoulders of a bigger boy. Big brother takes care of little brother. Big brother loves little brother. Little brother loves big brother. It is not individual action, but relationships between people that seem important to convey in a child's first encounter with the printed word. So what it's implying here is that in the Western one you have an individual. Yeah? And that's how we're supposed to interpret the world, even from our very early language acquisition. But in the Chinese book of the same era, and of course there would have been hundreds of books, this might be cherry picking. We're looking at Nisbett's argument here and trying to make sense of it if we can. Big brother takes care of little brother, and they love each other. So in Confucianism, one of the biggest values is this. I'm using a mouse to write here, so forgive me if it's not right. Ren, or in Korean this would be in. Human-heartedness, benevolence, okay, and this is one of the greatest Confucian values. And this kind of shiot here, this represents a person, and this represents two. So goodness or benevolence is found in the relationship between two people. So you can see it linguistically. Whereas in the West, you know, one of the central figures of Western morality, individuals, whether it's Jesus Christ or the cross and things like that. So perhaps that works like that in linguistic terms. Indeed, the Western style self is virtually a figment of the imagination to the East Asian. As philosopher Hu Xi writes, in the Confucian human-centered philosophy, man cannot exist alone. All actions must be in the form of interaction between man and man. Man is by nature a political animal, and you would also have John Donne's For Whom the Bell Tolls. Similar ideas there. The person always exists within settings, in particular situations where there are particular people with whom one has a relationship of a particular kind, and the notion that there can be attributes or actions that are not conditioned on social circumstances is foreign to the Asian mentality. Particular situations with particular people in relationships of a particular kind. So sometimes I'm a professor, a gyosu, sometimes I'm a father, sometimes I'm a dongseng, sometimes I'm a hyung, a younger brother, an older brother. Sometimes I'm a 친구, a samcheon. You have all these different titles in East Asian, South Korean relationships, and few of them involve your name. My name is David, but a lot of the time I'm adopting a title or a role. And according to that title or role, it's not what I want to do, but it's what is required, expected of that position, of that title. So to say that there would be one universal or one absolute way of acting wouldn't be correct, because the way that I would have to act as the elder brother would be very different from the way I would be expected to act as the younger brother. And I would have to change my behavior, I would have to change my language, my physicality, whether you make yourself big or smaller accordingly. These change. So because it's all relationships and people adopting a position in that hierarchy, the idea that there would be one self that acts consistently, you take that To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, and one of the attributes of Atticus Finch is that, a positive one, he is the same in the street as he is in his backyard. He was a man of consistency. This was what was seen as a great, noble and virtuous thing to be, but that wouldn't be quite right according to this general Asian concept where you're meant to change according to things. Again, make sure you understand it and then critically analyze it yourself. Edward T. Hall introduced the notion of low context versus high context societies to capture differences in self-understanding. To the Westerner, it makes sense to speak of a person as having attributes that are independent of circumstances or particular personal relations. This self, this bounded, impermeable, free agent, can move from group to group, setting to setting, without significant alteration. But for the Easterner, and for many other peoples to one degree or another, the person is connected, fluid, and conditional. As philosopher Donald Munro put it, East Asians understand themselves in terms of their relation to the whole, such as the family, society, Tao principle, or pure consciousness. The person participates in a set of relationships that make it possible to act, and purely independent behavior is usually not possible or really even desirable. Independent behavior cannot exist because you cannot be independent. You have to be always connected to another person, the family, the society, the principles, things like that. You're always connected, and who you are and what you do is fluid and conditional. Now, if you consider that what is expected of you and how you speak, the language in honorific language settings, when you go from 존댓말, honorific, to 반말, non-honorific language, your language is changing, your name is changing, your title is changing. So the idea of a set, constant self obviously gets diluted and lost. Of course, this also happens in Western societies and in Eastern societies. People also act as individuals. I understand that. I can see what Nisbett is trying to do, though, and talk in general on this kind of scale or spectrum rather than just yes or no binaries, which will never quite work. Since all action is in concert with others, or at the very least affects others, harmony in relationships becomes a chief goal of social life. I presented a schematic illustration intended to capture the different types of sense of self in relationship to in-group or close circle of friends and family. The illustration also conveys relative distance between in-group and out-group, or people who are mere acquaintances at most. Easterners feel embedded in their in-groups and distant from their out-groups. They tend to feel they are very similar to in-group members, and they are much more trusting of them than of out-group members. Westerners feel relatively detached from their in-groups and tend not to make as great distinctions between in-group and out-group. So we'll have a look here. It comes down. One thing I've noticed about this in-group and out-group is that in Korean relationships, if you are in that in-group with people, you can do what you like. You have a great deal of freedom. If you're in that in-group with a circle of friends, In Koreans, it's it's very trusting, it's very close. But if you're not in that group, it's almost as if you can never be in that group. You're in or you're out of those groups, and it's hard to, you know, break across or go through those gaps. It's been looked at in terms of regionalism, maybe between Daegu and Gwangju, in terms of age, in terms of family. There's always an in-group and an out-group, whereas in Western society, or Northwestern, Nisbett is saying, is that people don't so much distinguish between in-group and out-group as much. Of course they still do, but not as much. Some linguistic facts illustrate the so-called psychological gap between East and West. In Chinese, there is no word for individualism. The closest one can come is the word for selfishness. The Chinese character Zhen, benevolence, means two men. That's the one I explained before. In Japanese, the word I, meaning the transsituational, unconditional, generalized self with all its attributes, goals, abilities, and preferences, is not often used in conversation. Instead, Japanese has many words for I depending on audience and context. When a Japanese woman gives an official speech, she customarily uses watashi, which is the closest Japanese comes to the transsituational I. When a man refers to himself in relation to his colleague chums, he might say boku or ore. When a father talks to his child, he says otosan. A young girl might refer to herself by her nickname when talking to a family member. Tomo is going to school today. The Japanese often call themselves Djibouti, the etymology of which leads to a term meaning my portion. So this idea of I, and no matter who I would talk to as a Western in a Western society, that I stays the same, and it's connected to my psychological sense of self. So if I was speaking to, let's say, one of my professors or seniors, I would say, well, yes, I think this is a good idea, and I would like to do that. And if I was speaking to my son or my daughter, I would say, well, yes, I think that's a good idea, and we should do that. That I stays the same across all relationships, and that I is connected to wherever we perceive ourselves to be, whether it's here, wherever this I is, but it's constant. And yet the language and the identity of that I in Eastern one is said that it might change. Certainly, you know, in Korean you have the 저, 저도, and 나도, that changes between honorific and non-honorific. And so do titles. So there's not a constant I throughout. It's always changing. Give some more examples. In Korean, the sentence, could you come to dinner, requires different words for you. It should be no or 당신, or, you know, you can't say the names of elderly people in Korean. 실장님, 교수님, all these different titles, but you don't say people's names. So they're a position. They're a relationship rather than an individual sometimes. So that happens, but also for dinner, depending on whether one was inviting a student or a professor. I guess, you know, you might say 밥 먹자, 아니면 식사하세요. You know, if you have 밥 or 식사, the words change. So there's no constant. Such practices reflect not mere politeness or self-effacement, but rather the Eastern conviction that one is a different person when interacting with different people. One is a different person when interacting with different people. Not the same constant, but fluid, moving, pragmatic, changing to the situation. Consider that idea. Is that something you agree with or disagree with there? Tell me about yourself. Seems a straightforward enough question to ask of someone, but the kind of answer you get very much depends on what society you ask it in. North Americans will tell you about their personality traits, friendly, hardworking, role categories, teacher, I work for a company, and activities. Americans don't condition their self-descriptions much on context. The Chinese, Japanese, and Korean self, on the other hand, very much depends on context. A study asking Japanese and Americans to describe themselves either in particular contexts or without specifying a particular kind of situation showed that Japanese found it very difficult to describe themselves without specifying a particular kind of situation, at work, at home, with friends. Americans, in contrast, tended to be stumped when the investigators specified a context. I am what I am. When describing themselves, Asians make reference to social roles, I'm Joan's friend, to a much greater extent than Americans do. Another study found that twice as many Japanese as American self-descriptions referred to other people. I cooked dinner with my sister. So describing ourselves, studies show that for Asian people or Japanese people here, they describe themselves in relationship to others or in particular contexts rather than as a constant or steady being. And this is to make no judgments on whether these studies are accurate or whether one is better than the other. One interesting thing that is second nature to many Koreans, but I always found it a little bit strange, is when, say, a woman of 30, 40 years of age is referred to as her son's mother. So the son might be called Donghyun, the mother might be called Juhi, but Juhi is simply Donghyun이엄마. Okay, so the person doesn't have their own individual name or characteristic, rather they exist as a relationship to another person. And I know that might seem sort of patriarchal or 성차별, this gender discrimination favoring the boys, but it also, and I agree, but it also does imply that the person doesn't have an existence outside of someone else. So it might be an extension of that. When North Americans are surveyed about their attributes and preferences, they characteristically overestimate their distinctiveness. On question after question, North Americans report themselves to be more unique than they really are, whereas Asians are much less likely to make this error. Westerners also prefer uniqueness in the environment and in their possessions. Social psychologists Hee-jung Kim and Hazel Marcus ask Koreans and Americans to choose which object in a pictured array of objects they preferred. Americans chose the rarest object, where Koreans chose the most common object. Asked to choose a pen as a gift, Americans chose the least common color, offered and East Asians the most common. It's revealing that the word for self-esteem in Japanese is serufu estimu, which would be the Japanese. There is no indigenous term that captures the concept of feeling good about one's self. Another story that I heard was when, I believe it was Fukuzawa Yukichi, who was one of the pioneers of the Meiji Restoration and the modernization of Japan. He studied in Europe. Also, Kim Il-jun, a Korean modernity thinker, studied with him. And when Fukuzawa Yukichi was translating J.S. Mill's On Liberty, there was no Japanese word for liberty. There was no Japanese word for this kind of freedom. There was a sense of not doing your duty. There was a neglect of duty, but there wasn't this idea of having freedom. So linguistically, it's interesting to see which words come. Westerners are more concerned with enhancing themselves in their own and others' eyes than are Easterners. Americans are much more likely to make spontaneous favorable comments about themselves than are Japanese. When self-appraisal measures are administered to Americans and Canadians, it turns out that, like the children of Lake Wobegon, they are pretty much all above average. Asians rate themselves much lower on most dimensions, not only endorsing fewer positive statements, but being more likely to insist that they have negative qualities. It's not likely that the Asian ratings merely reflect a requirement for greater modesty that exists for North Americans. Asians are in fact under greater compunction to appear modest. But the difference in self-ratings exists even when participants think their answers are completely anonymous. So you might have experienced this as well. You ask, give a generalization. That's what it is again, but it rings true. So if you ask a Westerner, like, what do you do? They say, I play guitar, I play drums, I play guitar. Are you any good? Yeah, I'm pretty good. And then you hear them and you think, you're not that good, actually. You might ask your Korean friend, do you play any instruments? Oh, I play the piano. Are you good? Not really, no, I'm pretty bad. Then you hear them play the piano and you think, wow, that's actually very good. So there is this difference in how people evaluate themselves. So it's not just the relationships with others here. He's talking about how people perceive themselves, and Nisbett is making the suggestion that Westerners perceive themselves as being better than they are, more unique than they are, and Asian people, in contrast, perceive themselves as being more inferior than their reality. They downplay their own skills. Let's continue. It isn't that Asians feel badly about their own attributes. Rather, there is no strong cultural obligation to feel that they are special or unusually talented. The goal for the self in relation to society is not so much to establish superiority or uniqueness, but to achieve harmony within a network of supportive social relations and to play one's part in achieving collective ends. These goals require a certain amount of self-criticism, the opposite of tooting one's own horn. If I am to fit in with the group, I must root out those aspects of myself that annoy others or make their tasks more difficult. In contrast to the Asian practice of teaching children to blend harmoniously with others, some American children go to schools in which each child gets to be a VIP for the day. In my hometown a few years ago, the school board actually debated whether the chief goal of the schools should be to impart knowledge or to inculcate self-esteem. I appreciated a cartoon that appeared about the same time showing a door with the label Esteem Room. So, they're looking at the goals of education and the goals of people here. So if you take the Aristotelian idea, the idea from Aristotle of the telos, you can determine whether something is good or bad according to the telos of a thing. So if you take a pen, is this a good pen or a bad pen? Well, does it achieve its goal? What is its purpose? The purpose of a pen is to write. So if the pen writes, it's a good pen, and if it doesn't write, it's a bad pen. It might look brilliant, might have fancy colors, it might have gold on it, all these kind of things, but if it doesn't achieve its aim, its telos, then it's a bad pen, and vice versa. Even if it looks terrible, but it writes, it's good. So what is the telos of a human being? They might be different in the East and the West. In the West, we might have this idea that the goal is to be an individual. The goal is to separate yourself from other people as much as possible and impart yourself so you are a fully rounded individual with thoughts, with desires, with fears and hopes and wants. That might be what the West perceives as the telos, and you might see that in the idea that the spiritual leader of the West being Jesus, an individual. And if you take this idea here, we have self-criticism. Now, in North Korea and also during parts of China and things like that, they were group criticisms. So people had to do group critical sessions. It's a bit like what people do in Alcoholics Anonymous, and they have to sit around and say their faults. But these would be expected in sort of North Korean society. We have to sit around, and those people in North Korea sit around and say, well, this is what I didn't do well. This is where I let down the country, let down the nation. Of course, there is these kind of things in the West as well. Criticism in the Catholic tradition, in the Christian Catholic tradition, would be people doing it secretly to the priest. You don't do it in public, but you go and the priest knows who you are, of course, especially if you're in a small village or something like that. But there is this idea that you're doing it anonymously. Okay, so it's not public, it's not self-criticism. So you might want to think, what is the telos of the individual in the East and the West? Not in terms of what is the real telos, but what is the telos perceived by society? Japanese school children are taught how to practice self-criticism both in order to improve their relations with others and to become more skilled in solving problems. This stance of perfectionism through self-criticism continues throughout life. Sushi chefs and math teachers are not regarded as coming into their own until they've been at their job for a decade. Throughout their careers, in fact, Japanese teachers are observed and helped by their peers to become better at their jobs. Contrast this with the American practice of putting teachers' college graduates into the classroom after a few months of training and then leaving them alone to succeed or not to the good or ill fortune of a generation of students. An experiment by Stephen Hine and his colleagues captures the difference between the Western push to feel good about the self and the Asian drive for self-improvement. The experimenters asked Canadian and Japanese students to take a bogus creativity test and then gave the students feedback indicating that they had done very well or very badly. The experimenters then secretly observed how long the participants worked on a similar task. The Canadians worked longer on the task if they had succeeded. The Japanese worked longer if they had failed. The Japanese weren't being masochistic. They simply saw an opportunity for self-improvement and took it. The study has intriguing implications for skill development in both the East and West. Westerners are likely to get very good at a few things they start out doing well to begin with. Easterners seem more likely to become Jacks and Jills of all trades. So the Eastern people would be more all-rounded. They'd be more well-rounded, sorry, I should say, in that sense. I've always found one interesting thing with... it's really hard to write like this. I need to get a pen. With hagwons, or academies, right? So these would be education institutes. Now, in South Korea, you will find that the people they go to after-school academies to study more. Which kind of people go to these things? Generally, the best students. The best students study the most. When I was growing up, and I was fortunate enough to go to some very good schools, but it was the students that were falling behind that had to go to these things to catch up. So there was always a definite difference in my thing with like extracurricular education. With hagwons and academies, the Koreans, they go and they keep going, especially the smart children. Whereas Western students might feel that as long as you've got a certain level, a certain mark, you don't need to push anymore. You have achieved this. So that's just from a personal view of this. Independence versus interdependence. The broad differentiation between the two types of societies we have been discussing has been a staple notion of social science since the 19th century. The distinction is similar to that made by 19th century German social scientists, notably Ferdinand Tönnies, who made a useful distinction for comparing cultures, namely between a Gemeinschaft, a community based on a shared sense of identity, and a Gesellschaft, an institution intended to facilitate action to achieve instrumental goals. So two types of communities here. Shared sense of identity and to achieve instrumental goals. A Gemeinschaft is based on relationships that exist for their own sake and rest on a sense of unity and mutuality. For example, relationships among family members, church congregations, or a network of friends. It is based on sympathy, frequent face-to-face interaction, shared experiences, and even shared property. A Gesellschaft is based on interactions that are mostly a means to an end. It frequently involves exchange of goods and labour and is often based on bargaining and contracts. Such social systems allow for personal gain and competitive advantage. Corporations and bureaucracies are examples of Gesellschaften. No one thinks a given institutional society is exclusively of the Gemeinschaft or Gesellschaft sort. They are merely ideal types. But the distinction is of great analytic importance for much of modern social science, especially for cultural psychology. The Gemeinschaft is often termed a collectivism social system, and the Gesellschaft is often labelled an individualist social system. So the two types of social systems, a collective and an individual. The terms interdependent and independent proposed by Hazel Marcus and Shinobu Kitayama convey similar notions, and these are the ones I will normally use. So independent is individualist and interdependent is collectivist. Training for independence or interdependence starts quite literally in the crib. Whereas it is common for American babies to sleep in a bed separate from their parents or even in a separate room, this is rare for East Asian babies and, for that matter, babies pretty much everywhere else. Instead, sleeping in the same bed is far more common. The differences are intensified in waking life. This, from my experience, is very true. From a very young age, I had to sleep by myself, and despite all the monsters that you see behind the curtains and under the bed and all of these kind of things, you get through it and you go. Whereas in South Korea, just an experience here, whole families sleep together, And this might come from space or things, but I've seen 3 generations from the grandfather, the child, and the grandson, the granddaughter, all sleep on the same bed in the floor, and that would be very strange for a Western family to consider. Over here, for some people, not everybody, but for, let's say, a proportion, to make it a generalization, it's completely applicable for many people to sleep together here. The differences are intensified in waking life. Adoring adults from several generations often surround the Chinese baby. The Japanese baby is almost always with its mother. The close association with mother is a condition that some Japanese apparently would like to continue indefinitely. Investigators at the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research recently conducted a study requiring a scale comparing the degree to which adult Japanese and American respondents want to be with their mothers. The task proved very difficult because the Japanese investigators insisted that a reasonable endpoint on the scale would be, "I want to be with my mother almost all the time." The Americans, of course, insisted that this would be uproariously funny to American respondents and would cause them to cease taking the interview seriously. Independence for Western children is often encouraged in rather explicit ways. Western parents constantly require their children to do things on their own and ask them to make their own choices. Would you like to go to bed now, or would you like to have a snack first? The Asian parent makes the decision for the child on the assumption that the parent knows best what is good for the child. Parents who work to create an independent child shouldn't be surprised when the training works so well that their children balk at threats to their freedom of choice. Social psychologists Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper asked American, Chinese, and Japanese children aged 7 to 9 to solve anagrams such as, "What word can be made from great?" Some of the children were told to work on a particular category of anagrams. Other children were given a choice about which anagrams to solve, and still others were told that the experimenter had spoken to the child's mum, who would like the child to work on a particular category. The researchers then measured the number of anagrams solved and the time spent working on them. The American children showed the highest level of motivation, spending more time on the task and solving more anagrams when they were allowed to choose the category. The American children showed the least motivation when it was mum who chose the category, suggesting that they felt their autonomy had been encroached upon and they had therefore lost some of their intrinsic interest in the task. The Asian children showed the highest level of motivation when mum chose the category. Difference in performance when we feel like we are acting independently or we are acting because somebody has asked us to do something. Different cultures, it is suggested, react differently from this. So if I were to teach a university class in the West and I said to the people there, for your midterm report, you have to choose your study topic, you have to choose what area of research you're going to do, they would probably like it because it was freedom. If I suggest the same thing sometimes to Asian students, they might say, "What's the question? What am I meant to do?" They're looking for some guidance so that they know they can be more motivated to do it. Whether that still continues today is something to consider. An emphasis on relationships encourages a concern with the feelings of others. When American mothers play with their toddlers, they tend to ask questions about objects and supply information about them. But when Japanese mothers play with their toddlers, their questions are more likely to concern feelings. Japanese mothers are particularly likely to use feeling-related words when their children misbehave. The farmer feels bad if you did not eat everything your mum cooked for you. The toy is crying because you threw it. The wall says ouch. Concentrating attention on objects, as American parents tend to do, helps to prepare children for a world in which they are expected to act independently. Focusing on feelings and social relations, as Asian parents tend to do, helps children to anticipate the reactions of other people with whom they will have to coordinate their behavior. Another one I believe I've read that Western people focus on nouns more, whereas in Korean the focus is always on the verb. So, you can have a whole Korean conversation just with verbs. 먹었어? 먹었어. Did you eat? I ate. Right? But you're just saying 먹었어? 먹었어. The attention is always on the verbs, so you listen to the end of the sentence to see what the verb is. Whereas in the English language, the attention is on the nouns. They're the first things that you learn, cup, ball, pen, book, camera, etc. So the way we approach the language is also different. And that's why it's hard sometimes for, Western people to learn Korean, because they've got to adapt their mind to thinking, I don't need to use pronouns, I, you, he, I don't need to use them, but I need to use the verbs, these doing things. And that's very counterintuitive sometimes. The consequences of this differential focus on the emotional states of others can be seen in adulthood. There is evidence that Asians are more accurately aware of the feelings and attitudes of others than are Westerners. For example, Jeffrey Sanchez Burks and his colleagues showed to Koreans and Americans evaluations that employers had made on rating scales. The Koreans were better able to infer from the ratings just what the employers felt about their employees than were the Americans, who tended simply to take the ratings at face value. This focus on others' emotions extends even to perceptions of the animal world. Just before we go to the animals, I guess here in Korean, you might describe it as nunchi. Now, there has been some work done on nunchi recently. Uni Hong wrote a book and a couple of articles that said nunchi is the Korean secret to happiness. Nunchi brings you happiness. You'd have to break down, of course, however, that there is this is really difficult. That there are two types of nunchi, right? There is nunchi roll and nunchi ga. There is nunchi roll poda and nunchi가 있다. Right? Two types of nunchi. To see nunchi and to have nunchi. Now, definitely, if you have nunchi, nunchi가 있다, you have nunchi, or your nunchi is quick, nunchi bala, that means that you're able to pick up on these feelings, quite well. You're able to judge these things. But this nunchi 를 보다, sometimes that's when there's something you want to do, you want to say something, you want to eat something, but because of other people and the situation that you're in, you don't do that. Now, you might say that Koreans have in general better nunchi than Westerners or Americans, and a key to surviving in Korean society is to have good nunchi. Sometimes you have to look at the nunchi and act accordingly. On the other hand, doing that can suppress individuality, because people have things that they want to get out and say, and then they can't, and then that builds up. And you also see very high suicide rates in South Korea, very high in the OECD. So this idea can be good or bad depending where you go with it. Just to focus on nunchi가 있다 would be incorrect. I think it needs to include nunchi를 보다 as well, which is not a guide to happiness, I don't think. So, animals. Takuma Sada and I showed underwater video scenes to Japanese and American students and asked them to report what they saw. The Japanese students reported seeing more feelings and motivations on the part of fish than did Americans. For example, the red fish must be angry because its scales were hurt. Similarly, Kai Ping Peng and Phoebe Ellsworth showed Chinese and American students animated pictures of fish moving in various patterns in relation to one another. For example, a group might appear to chase an individual fish or to scoot away when the individual fish approached. The investigators asked the students what both the individual fish and the groups of fish were feeling. The Chinese readily complied with the requests. The Americans had difficulty with both tasks and were literally baffled when asked to report what the group emotions might be. So is there a lack of empathy with the group there? I often think it's funny if you put on South Korean TV, if there are dogs or animals on the channel, on the entertainment program, they will often, South Koreans will often, the producers at least, will superimpose voices onto the dog. This is what the dog is saying right now. Oh, I'm hungry. Where's my master? I'm going to go over here. They give the dog voices. They're able to empathize or see what those dogs are feeling. Of course, that happens a little bit in the West, but that's more sort of Dr. Dolittle type thing. It's quite common over here. The relative degree of sensitivity to others' emotion is reflected in tacit assumptions about the nature of communication. Westerners teach their children to communicate their ideas clearly and to adopt a transmitter orientation. That is, the speaker is responsible for uttering sentences that can be clearly understood by the hearer, and understood, in fact, more or less independently of the context. The Western individual is a transmitter. It is the speaker's fault if there is a miscommunication. So the responsibility is on the individual or the child to communicate clearly what you want. And if there's any miscommunication, it's on the person that was saying it. It's their fault for not accurately describing what they intend, what they want, what they are trying to get across. Asians, in contrast, teach their children a receiver orientation, meaning that it is the hearer's responsibility to understand what is being said. So sometimes students will come to me, they'll come to my office, and they won't say what's wrong. I'm expected to understand what is wrong. They won't say out loud, well, David, I have a problem with this, or this is really difficult. David, I want you to help me with this. They won't often say that aloud. They will wait for me. I have to be able to pick apart what they want, find that, and get to that. And that requires the nunchi, because if I do that well, I'm fulfilling my obligation or my role, my responsibility in that role. It's my job to understand and to be able to see those things, whereas the lower person in the relationship, which would be a student, I don't think of them as lower, but in this context, it would not be their place or their position to put such an imposition on a higher thing. So they're waiting for the person to see it, to find it. That's what it's arguing here, is a general trend between the two. If a child's loud singing annoys an American parent, the parent would be likely just to tell the kid to pipe down. No ambiguity there. The Asian parent would be more likely to say, "How well you sing a song." At first the child might feel pleased, but it would likely dawn on the child that something else might have been meant, and the child would try being quieter or not singing at all. I'm sure many of you out there have been told to shut up by your mum, and you're thinking, that's totally not true. It doesn't all have to be true or all have to be wrong in your eyes. It's, piecing it together, trying to get the large idea of what is going on here. Westerners, and perhaps especially Americans, are apt to find Asians hard to read because Asians are likely to assume that their point has been made indirectly and with finesse. Meanwhile, the Westerner is in fact very much in the dark. Asians, in turn, are apt to find Westerners, perhaps especially Americans, direct to the point of condescension or even rudeness. There are many ways of passing the distinction between relatively independent and relatively interdependent societies, but in illustrating these, it might be helpful to focus on four related but somewhat distinct dimensions. Insistence on freedom of individual action versus a preference for collective action. Desire for individual distinctiveness versus a preference for blending harmoniously with the group. A preference for egalitarianism and achieved status versus acceptance of hierarchy and ascribed status. A belief that the rules governing proper behavior should be universal versus a preference for particularistic approaches that take into account the context and the nature of the relationships involved. These dimensions are merely correlated with one another, and it is possible, for example, for a given society to be quite independent in terms of some dimensions and much less so in terms of others. Social scientists have attempted to measure each of these dimensions and other associated ones in a variety of ways, including value surveys, studies of archived material, and experiments. Some of the most interesting survey material comes from the study of business people from different cultures. Such studies provide particularly convincing evidence because so much is held more or less constant, including relative wealth and educational levels. In the classic study of this sort, Gerrit Hofstede provided even more comparability than most. All of his participants, who came from dozens of different societies, were employees of IBM. He found dramatic cultural differences in values even among Big Blue employees. Similar data have been collected by Charles Hampton Turner and Alphonse Trompenaars, who are professors at an international business school in Holland. Over a period of several years, they gave dozens of questions to middle managers, taking seminars they conduct throughout the world. The participants in their seminars, 15,000 all told, were from the US, Canada, Australia, Britain, the Netherlands, Sweden, Belgium, Germany, France, Italy, Singapore, and Japan, and a small number from Spain and Korea as well. Hampton Turner and Trompenas presented their students with dilemmas in which independent values were pitted against interdependent values. To examine the value of individual distinction versus harmonious relations with the group, Hampton Turner and Trompenas asked the managers to indicate which of the following types of job they preferred. Jobs in which personal initiatives are encouraged and individual initiatives are achieved versus jobs in which no one is singled out for personal honour, but in which everyone works together. More than 90% of American, Canadian, Australian, British, Dutch and Swedish respondents endorsed the first choice, the individual freedom alternative, versus fewer than 50% of Japanese and Singaporeans. Preferences of the Germans, Italians, Belgians and French were intermediate. The US is sometimes described as a place where, if you claim to amount to much, you should be able to show that you can change your area code every 5 years or so. This was before the phone company started changing people's area codes without waiting for them to move. In some other countries, the relationship with the corporation where one is employed and the connection with one's colleagues there are more highly valued than in the US and presumed to be more or less permanent. To assess this difference among cultures, Hampton Turner and Trompenas asked their participants to choose between the following expectations. If I apply for a job in a company, A, I will almost certainly work there for the rest of my life, or B, I'm almost sure the relationship will have a limited duration. More than 90% of Americans, Canadians, Australians, British and Dutch thought that a limited job duration was likely. This was true for only about 40% of Japanese, though it would doubtless be substantially higher today after downsizing has come to Japan. The French, Germans, Italians and Belgians were again intermediate. These numbers are important. You'll always find, well, that's not true because I know this person. Well, that's not true because I saw this happen. So there are always exceptions to the rules, and one swallow does not a summer make. That's how that works. But what you're understanding here is it's not everyone. It's never everyone. We're never talking about the West and the East as monoliths where 100% of these people do the same thing. That's not the idea. It's more about what percentage of the people do these things in different places. And if there are differences, where are the differences? Why do they occur, and what results do they produce? So just be aware that we're generally talking, this book is based on differences when the numbers are sort of 90% and 40% rather than 100 and 0. That's what's going on here. It's more about differences in degree. To examine the relative value placed on achieved versus ascribed status, Hampton Turner and Trompenas asked their participants whether or not they shared the following view. Becoming successful and respected is a matter of hard work. It is important for a manager to be older than his subordinates. Older people should be more respected than younger people. More than 60% of Americans and these respondents rejected the idea of status being based in any way on age. About 60% of Japanese, Korean and Singapore respondents accepted hierarchy based in part on age. French, Italians, Germans and Belgians were again intermediate, though closer to the other Europeans than to Asians. So your worth, whether you're good or you're bad or respected or not respected, should it be based on your individual actions, who you are as a person and what you do? Should it be based on your status, one of those status, or your identity? One of those statuses is age, which comes also with title. Whether you're a hakuseng or you go up into becoming an ajoshi or halaboji or ajuma. So should that change, and where do those changes take place? There's a difference how people respond. Needless to say, there is great potential for conflict when people from cultures having different orientations must deal with one another. This is particularly true when people who value universal rules deal with people who think each particular situation should be examined on its merits, and that different rules might be appropriate for different people. Westerners prefer to live by abstract principles and like to believe these principles are applicable to everyone. To set aside universal rules in order to accommodate particular cases seemed immoral to the Westerner. To insist on the same rules for every case can seem at best obtuse and rigid to the Easterner, and at worst cruel. A lot of Western people don't understand the South Korean justice system, and this is not to say that the Western justice system is better or worse, but the rules do seem to change according to the situation and the person and the personal circumstances of what's going on. Sometimes it seems the rules are designed, or the laws, the sentencing is designed to appease public opinion. There's a good blog written in Korea by Matt Van Valkenburg called The Gusts of Popular Feeling, how according to what the public is demanding and requesting, the law has to kind of respond to that. It's not the law is consistent and logical every time, irrespective of feelings, which is the ideal form of the Western one, right? But over here, the law has a duty to the people, and it will move according to those feelings. That's the case that is made here, and you can also see that in business and in dealings in education as well. Many of Hamden Turner and Trompenaar's questions reveal what a marked difference exists among cultures in their preference for universally applicable rules versus special consideration of cases based on their distinctive aspects. Make sure you understand that. Universally applicable rules. It's like this all the time, every time. This is the rule doesn't change. Versus, yeah, but sorry, there's this thing now that we need to do. I'm sorry, yeah, but do you know who I am? That, right? There's a difference between these two things in general. One of their questions deals with how to handle the case of an employee whose work for a company, though excellent for 15 years, has been unsatisfactory for a year. If there is no reason to expect that performance will improve, should the employee be A, dismissed on the grounds that job performance should remain the grounds for dismissal regardless of the age of the person and his previous record, or B, is it wrong to disregard the 15 years the employee has been working for the company? One has to take into account the company's responsibility for his life. More than 75% of Americans and Canadians felt the employee should be let go. About 20% of Koreans and Singaporeans agreed with that view. About 30% of Japanese, French, Italians and Germans agreed, and about 40% of British, Australians, Dutch and Belgians agreed. Atypically for this question, the British and Australians were closer to the continental Europeans than to the North Americans. So, lots of differences in there, but does loyalty to a thing override performance? Well, most people say no. If you don't do the work, if you're not good enough, 3/4 of the people say you can't do it. However, that difference is hugely in this study on Singaporeans and Koreans. As these results show, Westerners' commitment to universally applied rules influences their understanding of the nature of agreements between individuals and between corporations. By extension, in the Western view, once a contract has been agreed to, it is binding, regardless of circumstances that might make the arrangement much less attractive to one of the parties than it had been initially. Controversial example: once a contract has been agreed to, it is binding regardless of circumstances that change. Now, if you look at Hanilagwange, so we're talking legal things, and this is a controversial example, but from a Western perspective and an Eastern perspective, Hanilagwange, Korea-Japanese relations, right? So there was a 1965 agreement, right? A contract that was signed. There was another one signed in, I might get this date wrong, 2014 or 2015. This one by Park Chung-hee, this one by Park Geun-hye. And, the current administration has said these contracts don't last anymore. They're not attractive to our parties anymore. So there is this idea that contracts can be seen to be broken. There is no universal thing to these. They can change because the South Korean situation has changed. So You see that there. And again, that's not to say one is right or wrong, but it does cause confusion among some people when they see this. They say, well, how can you do that? Whereas others, maybe the Asian people, the Koreans, they might say, well, that's exactly what we should do. So there are two different ways of looking at this thing. These very different outlooks regularly produce international misunderstandings. The Japanese-Australian sugar contract case in the mid-1970s provides a particularly dramatic example. Japanese sugar refiners contracted with Australian suppliers to provide them with sugar over a period of 5 years at the price of $160 per tonne. But shortly after the contract was signed, the value of sugar on the world market dropped dramatically. The Japanese thereupon asked for a renegotiation of the contract on the grounds that the circumstances had changed radically. But to the Australians, the agreement was binding, regardless of circumstances, and they refused to consider any changes. An important business implication of the differences that exist between independent and interdependent societies is that advertising needs to be modified for particular cultural audiences. Marketing expert Sang Pil-han and Sharon Shavit analyzed American and Korean advertisements in popular news magazines and women's magazines. They found that American advertisements emphasize individual benefits and preferences, make your way through the crowd alive with pleasure, whereas Korean advertisements are more likely to emphasize collective ones. We have a way of bringing closer together, ringing out the news of business friendships that really work. And it's no surprise also that one of the big things in Korea is uri. Uri means hour, and uri bank, uri unheng, which is uri bank. But another way you get this, this collective, is when, if I walk down the street with my son or a daughter, a halmoni, a grandmother, might come up and say, oh, uri adal, uri dal, our daughter, our granddaughter. People will talk, wives will talk about their husbands to their friends or to their family and say, uri nampion, our husband. And it's always this idea of the collective. It seems very strange to some people. You get used to it, so maybe you don't hear it anymore. And it's also changing a little bit. It's not as common, but it's very weird for people hearing it or being explained that's what's happening the first time, because it's so different, but it's there. When Han and Shavit performed experiments showing people different kinds of advertisements, they found that the individualist advertisements were more effective with Americans and the collective ones with Koreans. Independence versus interdependence is, of course, not an either-or matter. Every society and every individual is a blend of both. That's the key point. It turns out that it is remarkably easy to bring one or another orientation to the fore. Psychologists Wendy Garner, Shira Gabriel, and Angela Lee primed American college students to think either independently or interdependently. They did this in two different ways. In one experiment, participants were asked to read a story about a general who had to choose a warrior to send to the king. In an independent version, the king had to choose the best individual for the job. In an interdependent version, the general wanted to make a choice that would benefit his family. In another priming method, participants were asked to search for words in a paragraph describing a trip to a city. The words were either independent in nature, I, mine, or interdependent, we, ours. After reading the story or searching for words in the paragraph, participants were asked to fill out a value survey that assessed the importance they placed on individualist values, such as freedom and living a varied life, and collectivist values, such as belongingness and respect for elders. They also read a story in which Lisa refused to give her friend Amy directions to an art store because she was engrossed in reading a book. They were then asked whether Lisa's behaviour was inappropriately selfish. Students who had been exposed to an independence prime rated individualist values higher and collectivist values lower than did students exposed to an interdependence prime. The independence prime participants were also more forgiving of the book engrossed Lisa. Gardner and her colleagues repeated their study, adding Hong Kong students to the American sample, and also added an unprimed control condition. American students rated individualist values higher than collectivist values unless they had been exposed to an interdependence prime. Hong Kong students rated collectivist values higher than individualist values unless they had been exposed to an independence prime. So this idea of priming people for something, if you're cognitively, or if people put these ideas into your head, then you will take those ideas. So there's a great thing when people sort of do magic tricks, and they'll sort of say, think of a number, any number between 1 and 5, and somebody says 3. Okay, that's because I'm holding up the number 3 in my hands. You subconsciously prime people to think things. They don't realize it, but magicians and hypnotists and sales, advertising people, they all do priming. Now, what these studies have shown is that it's not just Western people are independent and Asian people are interdependent. They have the possibility for both. They have a natural way that they're going to go, right? They have this natural independence, interdependence that they will lean towards, but they have the possibility of doing the other one if they are primed for it. So, for example, if I'm living in England, I might live very independently and act like that. But when I come to Korea and live here, I can survive and I can do it and I can be successful because I have the ability to be interdependent. It just has to be in the right priming conditions. So it's not that this study is suggesting that it's not innate. It's not that you don't have the possibility of being interdependent or independent. You do. It's just that the conditions and the environments really affect which one comes to the fore, because it will be survival. It'll be an evolutionary idea that if you act wrong in society, you won't be successful. So you have to act accordingly. So maybe being primed shows that anyone can do these things. Of course, Easterners are constantly being primed with interdependence cues and Westerners with independence cues. This raises the possibility that even if their upbringing had not made them inclined in one direction or another, the cues that surround them would make people living in interdependent societies behave in generally interdependent ways, and those living in independent societies behave in generally independent ways. In fact, this is a common report of people who live in the other culture for a while. My favourite example concerns a young Canadian psychologist who lived for several years in Japan. He then applied for jobs at North American universities. Her advisor was horrified to discover that his letter began with apologies about his unworthiness for the jobs in question. Other evidence shows that self-esteem is highly malleable. Japanese who live in the West for a while show a notable increase in self-esteem, probably because the situations they encountered were in general more esteem-enhancing than those typical in Japan. The social psychological characteristics of people raised in very different cultures are far from completely immutable. So these can change, and perhaps with globalization, perhaps with the interconnectivity of the world, people going back and forth. Also, I would add these days, with things like Netflix and movies and streaming, we don't have to always travel to go there. You can experience these things, all day, on demand, on your smartphone to get these cultures. So I think, I talked at the beginning about maybe the two cultures are sort of diverging or coming towards each other. I think that might be the case here. Let me just double check how long we're gonna go. We have the debate section. Then we have this. Okay. Let's keep going. Variants of viewpoint. Excuse me while I drink some water. The work of Hamden Turner and Trompenas makes clear that the West is no monolith concerning issues of independence versus interdependence. There are also substantial regularities to the differences found in Western countries. In general, the Mediterranean countries, plus Belgium and Germany, are intermediate between the East Asian countries on the one hand and the countries most heavily influenced by Protestant Anglo-Saxon culture on the other. There is more regularity even than that. Someone has said, the idea moves west, meaning that values of individuality, freedom, rationality, and universalism become progressively more dominant and articulated as civilization moved westward from its origins in the Fertile Crescent. The Babylonians codified and universalized the law. The Israelites emphasized individual distinctiveness. The Greeks valued individuality even more and added a commitment to personal freedom, the spirit of debate and formal logic. The Romans brought a gift for rational organization and something resembling the Chinese genius for technological achievement. And, after a trough lasting almost a millennium, their successors, the Italians, rediscovered these values and built on the accomplishments of the Greek and Roman eras. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in Germany and Switzerland and largely bypassing France and Belgium, added individual responsibility and a definition of work as a sacred activity. The Reformation also brought a weakened commitment to the family and other in-groups, coupled with a greater willingness to trust out-groups, have dealings with their members. These values were all intensified in the Calvinist subcultures of Britain, including the Puritans and Presbyterians, whose egalitarian ideology laid the groundwork for the government of the United States. Thomas Jefferson was merely paraphrasing the Puritan sympathizer John Locke when he wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty." The Hampton-Turner and Trompenas findings for social values, as well as those of Hofstede, track this east-west ideological journey almost exactly. The further to the west a given country lies, the greater in general that country's endorsement of independent values. Moreover, these differences among European cultures are reflected in their subcultures in the United States, a fact documented in immigrant cultural histories by scholars such as economist Thomas Sowell. I once knew a very distinguished and well-placed social scientist, a crusty Scottish-American Presbyterian steeped in Calvinist rectitude. He had a son who was also a social scientist and who had to struggle from time to time to sustain his career during the 1970s, when jobs were scarce in the US. My colleague would sometimes state proudly that, although it would have been easy for him to do so, he never intervened to help his son's situation. The colleague's Anglo-Saxon Protestant friends would nod their approval of the justice of this stance in the face of the personal pain they knew the colleague had experienced. His Jewish and Catholic colleagues, with their more continental values, would stare in shocked belief at his lack of family feeling. At a level slightly more scientific than this anecdote, we generally find that it is white Protestants among the American participants in our studies who show the most Western patterns of behavior, and that Catholics and minority group members, including African Americans and Hispanics, are shifted somewhat toward Eastern patterns. So there are differences among the West. We had that expression there. It's not monolith, right? It's back on this page. That's what you want to consider as well. It's not one thing. It's not one thing. That's also the same with Korea. You know, Korea is not one thing. The East is not one thing. The West is not monolith. The West is not one. There are many differences inside the West. There are also major differences among Eastern cultures in all sorts of important social behavior and values, some of which are related to independence versus interdependence. I was in China in 1982 at the tail end of the Cultural Revolution. The country seemed extremely exotic in both its traditional aspects and its communist-imposed aspects. This was well before a Starbucks was installed in the Forbidden City. The first Western play to be performed in Beijing since the Revolution was mounted while I was there. It was Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. The choice seemed very strange. I regarded the play as being not merely highly Western in character, but distinctly American. Its central figure is a salesman, a man way out there in the blue riding on a smile and a shoe shine. To my astonishment, the play was a tremendous success, but Arthur Miller, who had come to China to collaborate on production of the play, provided a satisfactory reason for its reception. The play is about family, he said, and the Chinese invented family. He might have added that the play is also about face, or the need to have the respect of the community, and the Chinese also invented face. The Japanese have perhaps as much concern with face as do the Chinese, but probably less involvement with the immediate family and more commitment to the corporation. There are other marked differences between the Japanese and Chinese. The sociologist Robert Bellah, the philosopher Hajime Nakamura, the psychologist Dora Dien, and the social philosopher Lin Yutang, among many others, have detailed some of these differences. Though social constraints are in general greater on both Chinese and Japanese than on Westerners, The constraints come primarily from authorities in the case of the Chinese and chiefly from peers in the case of the Japanese. Control in Chinese classrooms, for example, is achieved by the teacher, but by classmates in Japan. Dora Dien has written that the Chinese emphasize particular dyadic two-person relationships while retaining their individuality, whereas the Japanese tend to submerge themselves in the group. Though both Chinese and Japanese are required to conform to move smoothly through their daily lives, the Chinese are said to chafe under the requirements and the Japanese actually to enjoy them. The Japanese are held to share with the Germans and the Dutch a need for order in all spheres of their lives. The Chinese share with Mediterraneans a more relaxed approach to life. It is sometimes argued that one particular type of social relationship is unique to the Japanese. This is ame, 2L, concept discussed at length by the Japanese psychoanalyst Teikyo Doi. Ame describes a relationship in which an inferior, a child or employee for example, is allowed to engage in appropriate behavior, to ask for an expensive toy, or to request a promotion at a time not justified by company policy as an expression of confidence that the relationship is sufficiently close that the superior will be indulgent. Ame facilitates the relationship, enhancing trust between the two parties and cementing bonds, though these results come at some cost to the autonomy of the inferior. The very real differences among Eastern cultures and among West cultures, however, shouldn't blind us to the fact that the East and West are in general quite different from each other with respect to a great many centrally important values and social psychological attributes. So if we have the West here and the East here, saying they're different, saying, well, actually the West has, different styles of the West. There might be this white American, and then you have mainland Europe, and you have this West. It's broken into little things, and the East would also have different variations of it. Sometimes a West and an East might be closer together than a West and a West. So it's all manners of degree and things like this, but whether this boundary here, West and East, is going to be broken down, or we need something else. Do we need to not use these terms anymore? Do we need to flip it around? That's a matter of discussion, and that's a matter of something for you to consider as we go through this. Let's continue, we're nearly done. Debate is almost as uncommon in modern Asia as in ancient China. In fact, the whole rhetoric of argumentation that is second nature to Westerners is largely absent in Asia. North Americans begin to express opinions and justify them as early as the show and tell sessions of nursery school. This is my robot, he's fun to play with because, in contrast, there is not much argumentation or trafficking in opinions in Asian life. A Japanese friend has told me that the concept of a lively discussion does not exist in Japan because of the risk to group harmony. It is this fact that likely undermined an attempt he once made to have an American-style dinner party in Japan, inviting only Japanese guests who expressed a fondness for the institution. From the martinis through the steak to the apple pie, the effort fell flat for want of opinions and people willing to defend them. The absence of a tradition of debate has particularly dramatic implications for the conduct of political life. Very recently, South Korea installed its first democratic government. Prior to that, it had been illegal to discuss North Korea. Westerners find this hard to comprehend, inasmuch as South Korea has performed one of the world's most impressive economic miracles of the past 40 years, and North Korea is a failed state in every respect, apart from its development of nuclear weapons. But due to the absence of a tradition of debate, Koreans have no faith that correct ideas will win in the marketplace of ideas. And previous governments protected their citizens by preventing discussion of communist ideas and North Korean practices. How do you feel about this assertion by Nisbett that South Korea does not have trust in its citizens to debate South Korea and North Korea, to put these two things together? So you have the National Security Act, which I believe, National Security Law, which came in around 1961 or around there, from Park Chung-hee, who decided that, to support or to have things, images, words, books of Kim Il-sung, those kind of people in South Korea is a criminal offense, and you go to jail for that. I think even up until 1994, there were a group of professors in South Korea that were charged for supporting North Korea. Also, there was the cafe, the restaurant in Hongdae, and it had the North Korea theme, and it had the pictures of maybe Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. They were taken down because there's a whole debate about Nambu Gwanghae and the North-South relations. But what he's suggesting here is that because of the way social life works and the identity of the self, there's not enough trust that people will have opinions, debate their opinions, and defend their opinions. Rather, they're always just going to go into the group collective harmony. So rather than debate things, let's just settle on the group decision, and that will be no North Korea. Maybe that has contributed to the continued division between the North and South. Maybe that's also why many South Koreans don't have much information about the North. It remains a bit of an enigma, a secret. You know, you can go on YouTube, you can go on Twitter, and you can see ambassadors and embassies posting daily life in North Korea. It's not a secret to the outside world. But to many South Koreans, it is, because it's illegal and it's drilled into their minds. And so that might have, serious implications for South Korean politics, military service, the economy, everything like that. So what is debate? The tradition of debate goes hand in hand with a certain style of rhetoric in the law and in science. The rhetoric of scientific papers consists of an overview of the ideas to be considered, a description of the relevant basic theories, a specific hypothesis, a statement of the methods and justification of them, a presentation of the evidence produced by the methods, an argument as to why the evidence supports the hypothesis, a refutation of possible counter-arguments, a reference back to the basic theory, and a comment on the larger territory of which the article is a part. For Americans, so if you're wondering how to write papers, there you go, and just break that down. For Americans, this rhetoric is constructed bit by bit from nursery school through college. By the time they are graduate students, it is second nature, but for the most part, the rhetoric is new to the Asian student, and learning it can be slow and painful. It is not uncommon for American science professors to be impressed by their hard-working, highly selected Asian students, and then to be disappointed by their first major paper, not because of their incomplete command of English, but because of their lack of mastery of the rhetoric common in the professor's field. In my experience, it is also not uncommon for professors to fail to recognize that it is the lack of the Western rhetoric style they are objecting to, rather than some deeper lack of comprehension of the enterprise they're engaged in. The combative rhetorical form is also absent from Asian law. In Asia, the law does not consist, as it does in the West for the most part, of a contest between opponents. More typically, the disputants take their case to a middleman whose goal is not fairness but animosity reduction by seeking a middle way through the claims of the opponents. There is no attempt to derive a resolution to a legal conflict from a universal principle. On the contrary, Asians are likely to consider justice in the abstract, by the book Western sense to be rigid and unfeeling. Negotiation also has a different character in the high-context societies of the East than in the low-context societies of the West. Political scientist Mushokoji Kinhaide characterizes the Western Irabi style as being grounded in the belief that man can freely manipulate his environment for his own purposes. This view implies a behavioral sequence whereby a person sets his objective, develops a plan designed to reach that objective, and then acts to change the environment in accordance with that plan. To a person having such a style, there's not much point in concentrating on relationships. It's the results that count. Proposals and decisions tend to be of the either-or variety because the Westerner knows what he wants and has a clear idea what is appropriate to give and to take in order to have an acceptable deal. Negotiations should be short and to the point so as not to waste time reaching the goal. The Japanese awase, harmonious style, rejects the idea that man can manipulate the environment and assumes instead that he adjusts himself to it. Negotiations are not thought of as a ballistic one-shot efforts never to be revisited, and relationships are presumed to be long-term. Either-or choices are avoided. There is a belief that short-term wisdom may be long-term folly. A Japanese negotiator may yield more in negotiations for a first deal than a similarly placed Westerner might, expecting that this will lay the groundwork for future trust and cooperation. Issues are presumed to be complex, subjective, and intertwined, unlike the simplicity, objectivity, and fragmentability that the American with the Arabi style assumes. So there are very dramatic social psychological differences between East Asians as a group and people of European culture as a group. East Asians live in an interdependent world in which the self is part of a larger whole. Westerners live in a world in which the self is a unitary free agent. Easterners value success and achievement in good part because they reflect well on the groups they belong to. Westerners value these things because they are badges of personal merit. Easterners value fitting in and engage in self-criticism to make sure that they do so. Westerners value individuality and strive to make themselves look good. Easterners are highly attuned to the feelings of others and strive for interpersonal harmony. Westerners are more concerned with knowing themselves and are prepared to sacrifice harmony for fairness. Easterners are accepting of hierarchy and group control. Westerners are more likely to prefer equality and scope for personal action. Asians avoid controversy and debate. Westerners have faith in the rhetoric of argumentation, in arenas from the law to politics to science. None of these generalizations apply to all members of their respective groups, of course. Every society has individuals who more nearly resemble those of other, quite different societies than they do those of their own society. And every individual within a given society moves quite a bit between the independent and interdependent poles over the course of a lifetime, over the course of a day, in fact. But the variations between and within societies, as well as within individuals, should not blind us to the fact that there are very real differences, substantial on the average, between East Asians and people of European culture. As nearly as we can tell, these social differences are much the same as the differences that characterized the ancient Chinese and Greeks. And if it was the social circumstances that produced the cognitive differences between ancient Chinese and Greeks, then we might expect to find cognitive differences between modern East Asians and Westerners that map onto the differences between the ancient Chinese and Greeks. If you need a conclusion for this, you will find it in this paragraph here. That lays out all of the things with the examples that it's gone through. It's given these disclaimers that I've said, that on average there are differences, and these differences might be rooted in the philosophical groundings of the culture. So that is the chapter that I've asked you to read. If I just find a couple of bits now, you have an assignment that I would like you to complete if possible. Move myself there, that might work. You don't have to go through these questions in order. It's not like do 1, 2, 3. You can skip all these questions and do your own work. This is normally what we would discuss in class, and you would have to hear the views of other students. But consider these for me. How do you feel about some of the things presented in this book? Were there any of them that you thought, yeah, that's right, or you thought that's absolutely wrong? Why were they? If there are differences, do you accept that there are differences? If there are differences between the East and the West, what effect does this have on politics, economies? What effect does this have on dealing with COVID-19 coronavirus? Can we see different countries, societies react to that according to these Eastern and West differences? If there are differences, will they be resolved? Can they come together? How does that work? Is it possible to assess cultures and say that, well, this one is pretty good for this and this one is pretty good for that? So can we compare them in that way? How do you feel about comparing them? The final question here, which is probably the most important, I don't have it written down, is that I feel, or I guess, so you can please tell me if I'm wrong, that when you're reading that, you might say about the Asian style, well, not really, because Korea has become modern. This is modern Korea now. But if you were to do that for your parents or your grandparents, maybe it would be true. So if you consider that for you, many of these things seem a bit old-fashioned, not quite correct, but maybe for your parents or your grandparents, they seem true about the Asian society, then the really important question is this: when did it change? The next question would be perhaps even more important: why did it change? And then, what was the cause of the change? Did everybody just start watching Netflix and their minds changed? Or if Korea has become modern, if we're looking for something of what modern Korea is, we need to know what old Korea is or traditional Korea is. So consider that. You also want to consider that East and West, we're looking on geographic things. So I'm introducing the idea of time, right? So East and West, yeah, but modern East and old East is different. How are they changing over time? So think about those as well. There's a lot in there. You don't have to do any of these questions. You can find your own things to talk about. Now, just finally, as we are finished, if I take you to the Seoul e-class system, I wonder if we're still signed in. Should we have a look? Yes, we are. If you have any questions or comments about it, please feel free. You will find my email address and things there. You can do it through the system as well. Now, if we find this course, which is East and West Culture, what will be on here is that there will be an online lecture for next week. So just click that and make sure you're attending. It's not a live lecture. This is the lecture now. So once you've done that, that's your attendance for this. There will be an assignment. Okay, and so you have to complete an assignment based on this reading and this lecture. What you need to do is you need to give your thoughts on this. Now, you do this in two ways. You need two things. The first is descriptive statements. The second is normative statements. You need descriptive and normative statements. Descriptive statements are factual things. What happened? So a descriptive statement. In the book, Geography of Thought, Richard Nisbett said that Eastern people are more collective. It's a descriptive statement. It's just reporting, describing what was in the material. Normative. Normative means values. I think, 개인적으로, this is what I think. So you write some descriptive and normative sentences to show your understanding of the work, descriptive, then to show your interpretation or analysis, normative. If your work is 100% descriptive, that's like a Wikipedia page. It's like a review and it's boring. It tells me that you understood it, but it doesn't tell me anything else. It doesn't tell me anything about you. So 100% descriptive is not great. 100% normative, well, I think this and I think this and I think this. That's good, but it doesn't show me that you read the book. It doesn't show me that you read and understood the material. So you need descriptive and normative, put them together. Doesn't have to be 50-50. Could be 60-40, 80-20, 70, but you want those two in there somehow. Now, you need to give me your opinions on this. You can do this in three ways. The first way, open up Microsoft Word and write something, okay? Could be, depending on your ability, any length, but it should be good work, not just long work, because I have to go through a lot. So write something, just a page, something, half a page, your thoughts on this. You could do an audio record. You could pick up your phone and do it that way and put the file there. Or third, you could do it like this in a video, an audio type thing if you wish, because we're doing online classes, and if you have the capabilities, it's a good thing to learn, because we don't know how long this is going to be going. So, but whichever one of the three is best for you, writing, audio or video, you should have that. You should be able to put it online. If we have any trouble, we'll work it out, but it will be here in the assignments section. So try to put your work there. If you have any questions or comments, then just feel free to contact me, get in touch. 만약에 질문이 있으면 그냥 연락 주세요. I will help you and do what we can. As for now, I'll finish the video. Try to get some ideas out of that reading. Don't just follow me. Get your own thoughts on what that was, and feel free to reject and refuse and disagree with everything, or to agree with it. It's completely up to you. Okay, I'll stop the lecture now, and stay healthy, stay well. I hope to see you soon. Thank you.